Hey everyone. So tonight we're diving into something that hardly anyone thinks about anymore, but absolutely everyone in a medieval village depended on. The blacksmith. Not the knight with the sword, not the lord in the castle, not even the priest with all his holy authority. The blacksmith. The guy covered in soot and sweat who worked in a shop that smelled like burning metal and ambition and possibility. When you think about the Middle Ages, you probably imagine grand castles and mounted warriors and tournaments and all that romantic nonsense. But if you were actually living in a medieval village, if you were waking up in your little mud hut and going about your day, trying to survive, there was one person you would visit before almost anyone else. The blacksmith. He was the backbone of everything. Every tool, every horseshoe, every nail, every piece of metal that held your life together came from that man's hammer and fire. He was the one person you couldn't afford to lose. Before you get too comfortable, though, make sure you hit that like button if this kind of stuff fascinates you, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the people history forgot about. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to see who's tuning in from across the world, across different times and places. Now, settle in, maybe grab some tea or coffee, and let's talk about why a blacksmith was quite literally the most important person in the village. Sometimes the most powerful people in history aren't the ones sitting on thrones or wearing crowns. In a medieval village, when you needed something made, there was exactly one place to go: the blacksmith's shop. And let me tell you, that shop was the heart of everything. It wasn't just a place to pick up a new tool or get your horse shod. It was a nexus point, a gathering place, the economic and practical lifeblood of the entire community. Every single thing a blacksmith made was essential. Tools for farming, horseshoes, nails, hinges, locks, weapons, armor, pots and pans, kitchen implements, gate fittings. The list goes on and on. You can't build a civilization without nails. You can't farm without plowshares. You can't defend your village without weapons. And you can't get anywhere without horseshoes. The blacksmith made all of it. If the blacksmith stopped working, the village would essentially stop functioning. Let that sink in for a second. Every farmer depended on the blacksmith. Every merchant relied on him. Every knight who came through needed his services. Even the Lord himself couldn't do much without the blacksmith's work. It's almost absurd how dependent everyone was on this one guy with a hammer and a furnace. Think about what that meant practically. When a plow broke during harvest season, you couldn't wait 3 months for a replacement. You went to the blacksmith immediately. He would fix it or make you a new one, often within days. That's the difference between eating well for the year and starving. When your horse threw a shoe in the middle of a journey, you didn't have options. You found the nearest blacksmith and hoped he could help you quickly. The smith's hammer striking metal was like a drum beat, marking the pulse of village life. It kept everything moving forward. The blacksmith's craft was genuinely incredible, even by modern standards. We have electric furnaces and modern tools and metallurgical science, and yet the things medieval blacksmiths accomplished with nothing but fire, hammer, and pure skill still astound us today. They weren't just bashing metal randomly. They were artists and engineers rolled into one, working by instinct and experience. A master blacksmith understood the properties of different metals, the precise temperatures needed to work them, how to shape them into specific forms with exact measurements. They would heat iron or steel in a furnace until it glowed red, absolutely blazing, then pull it out at just the right moment and hammer it into shape on an anvil. Too hot and it would shatter like glass, not hot enough and it would crack right down the middle. The timing had to be perfect. 1 second too long in the fire and your entire day's work was ruined. One careless hammer strike and the metal was useless. They would reheat and hammer, gradually coaxing the metal into exactly the shape they needed. For a sword, a blacksmith might spend weeks perfecting it, folding the metal, heating it, hammering it, folding it again to build up layers and get the right balance of flexibility and strength. For something simple like a nail, it was faster but still required skill. You couldn't just lazily tap at metal and expect nails to come out. Each nail had to be formed precisely. Too thick and it wouldn't drive cleanly. Too thin and it would bend or break. The head had to be flattened correctly. Getting consistency across hundreds of nails took incredible expertise. Medieval blacksmiths were also innovators. They developed new techniques. They experimented with different metal combinations. They figured out how to make steel, which is far superior to pure iron, by carefully controlling carbon content in the metal. They didn't have chemistry textbooks, but they understood through experience and observation what worked and what didn't. A good blacksmith was essentially a scientist, constantly experimenting, constantly refining his methods. The best smiths became famous, and villages would compete to attract them. A really skilled blacksmith could name his price. He could demand better conditions, better living quarters, sometimes even a percentage of profits if he was truly exceptional. Because if you didn't have a good blacksmith, your village was at a serious disadvantage. Raiders could attack. Harvest equipment would break down, and you'd lose crops. Trade networks would collapse because you couldn't fix what broke. The physical reality of being a blacksmith was genuinely brutal. These weren't people working in comfortable conditions. They spent their days in shops that were essentially furnaces, infernos of heat and noise and danger. The heat from a blacksmith's forge could be absolutely staggering. We're talking temperatures sometimes exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make metal glow like a captured piece of the sun. You're standing right there next to this inferno, day after day, year after year, sweat pouring down your face, your clothes damp and clinging. The smoke was choking, thick and acrid, filling your lungs with every breath. There was no ventilation system, no modern safety equipment, nothing. Just a man, a hammer, and a roaring fire that wanted to destroy everything in its path. Blacksmiths were often significantly burnt, scarred from sparks that flew like tiny comets and accidental contact with hot metal that would leave marks for life. Their hands were calloused to an almost unimaginable degree, thick and rough like leather armor. Imagine working metal so constantly that your hands basically turn into leather, insensitive to heat and pain. Their eyesight often suffered from staring into the bright heat day after day, squinting until their eyes watered constantly. Their hearing was damaged from the constant clanging of metal on metal, that endless percussion that never quite stopped ringing in their ears, even at night. Many blacksmiths would develop lung problems from breathing in smoke for decades, their lungs slowly turning black from the inside. Some would go partially deaf from the noise, the world gradually becoming quieter until they were living in a kind of muffled silence. Despite all this, they kept working. Why? Because they were essential. Because their skills were irreplaceable. Because stopping meant letting the village down. Blacksmithing wasn't just a job, it was a calling. It required genuine dedication and resilience. You had to be willing to suffer for your craft, to sacrifice your body and health for the benefit of the community. And most medieval blacksmiths seemed to accept this as simply the cost of their profession. They grumbled, sure. They complained to the tavern keeper about aching joints and burned skin. but they showed up to the forge every day and did the work because their entire village depended on them. The training to become a blacksmith was intense and took years. This wasn't something you could pick up in a few weeks or months. A young boy apprenticed to a master blacksmith would spend 7 to 10 years learning the craft, decade of hard labor. He was learning through doing, through making mistakes, through getting burned and bruised until he understood the metal's mood by instinct. The master had absolute control. He could decide if the kid had potential or was wasting his time. Some apprentices eventually became journeymen, traveling from village to village, learning different techniques. After years, they might become masters themselves, able to set up their own shops. The system meant blacksmithing knowledge was carefully controlled and passed down through generations. You couldn't just wake up and decide to be a blacksmith. You had to earn it. You had to prove yourself worthy. This protected the blacksmith's status. Because his skills were rare, because they took years to acquire, because he was part of a long lineage of craftsmen, the blacksmith commanded respect. He wasn't just some random person with a hammer. He was a keeper of ancient knowledge and technique. When it came to trade and economy, the blacksmith was absolutely central. In many medieval villages, the blacksmith was one of the wealthiest people in the community. He could charge for his services. He could demand payment in coin, in goods, in food, in land. His work was so essential that people would pay whatever he asked, more or less. A farmer might give the blacksmith a percentage of his harvest in exchange for maintaining his tools throughout the year. A merchant might pay the blacksmith in exotic goods acquired during travels. A lord might grant the blacksmith special privileges, maybe tax exemptions or land of his own, to keep him satisfied and committed to the village. Some blacksmiths became so prosperous that they essentially became small-scale nobles themselves. They could afford to own property. They could have apprentices working for them, essentially a small business operation. They could accumulate wealth and status. This was unusual for common craftspeople in the medieval world. Most artisans lived relatively modest lives. But blacksmiths occupied this interesting middle space. They were technically common folk, but their skills were so valued that they often achieved wealth and status approaching the lower nobility. This made them influential. When a blacksmith spoke, people listened. When he had concerns about the village or the lord, there was a good chance something would actually change, because nobody wanted to risk losing his services or his goodwill. He was the rare commoner who could negotiate with nobility from a position of genuine strength. The blacksmith shop wasn't just a workplace. It was a social center, almost like a medieval version of a barber shop or a cafe, the place where everyone ended up eventually. People would gather there, not just to drop off broken tools or pick up new ones, but to talk, to hear gossip, to catch up on village news. The blacksmith would often work while people hung around watching, standing near the forge, feeling its warmth, mesmerized by the work. They'd chat, tell stories, discuss problems, debate village issues. Sometimes the blacksmith would offer advice or settle disputes. His shop became a place where informal justice was done, where agreements were made and witnessed, where the community's informal networks were maintained. The sound of the hammer became a kind of musical accompaniment to village life, the heartbeat of the place. You could hear it from most places in the village, a rhythmic clanging that meant the blacksmith was working, that life was continuing normally, that the village had the person it needed to survive. If that sound suddenly stopped for more than a day or two, people would get nervous. Is the blacksmith sick? Is he leaving? Has something happened? The psychological comfort of knowing the blacksmith was there actively working, was actually quite significant. It meant the village was functional. It meant essential repairs could be made. It meant the normal rhythms of life could continue. Medieval villages were fragile things, economically and practically, held together by thinner threads than we might imagine. One major disruption could cascade into disaster. Losing the blacksmith wasn't just losing one person's skills. It was potentially losing the ability to farm, to trade, to defend yourself, to maintain your homes and tools. It was losing the future. It was catastrophic. Now, the relationship between a blacksmith and the village lord was complicated and crucial. The lord technically had power over everyone in the village, including the blacksmith. But the blacksmith was also indispensable. So, what you often saw was a kind of negotiation, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, about what the blacksmith owed the lord and what the lord would provide the blacksmith in return. A lord might demand that the blacksmith prioritize making weapons for the lord's men, or that he create elaborate metalwork for the lord's estate. In exchange, the lord would provide the blacksmith with protection, ensure he had steady access to raw materials, maybe even supply him with additional workers or apprentices. Some blacksmiths developed incredibly close relationships with the yo, or lords, almost like trusted advisors. They'd be invited to important gatherings, consulted about decisions that might affect their work. Their opinions on matters ranging from military preparedness to construction projects would actually be valued. This wasn't the norm for ordinary villagers, most of whom had little direct contact with nobility. But the blacksmith's essential skills gave him unusual access and influence. Of course, this also meant that if the lord and the blacksmith fell into conflict, the consequences could be serious. A lord who wanted to punish or humiliate a blacksmith had various options. He could tax him excessively. He could conscript him for the lord's private projects without pay. He could even threaten to revoke his right to practice his trade. But these were nuclear options, rarely used, because both parties understood the mutual dependence. The lord needed the blacksmith working at full capacity, motivated and satisfied. The blacksmith needed the lord's protection and support. Most of the time, this relationship actually worked reasonably well, especially compared to the lord's treatment of ordinary peasants. Blacksmiths, more than almost anyone else in a medieval village, had genuine marketable skills that could be taken anywhere. A talented blacksmith could leave one village and be welcome in another. They could travel between regions, working for different masters, accumulating knowledge and wealth. This gave them a kind of freedom that most medieval peasants didn't have. They weren't locked to the land like serfs. They could theoretically move if conditions got bad. This mobility also meant that good blacksmiths were sought after. Villages would compete for them. A particularly skilled blacksmith might get multiple job offers. He could choose where to work, or at least negotiate harder for better terms than if he were the only blacksmith available. The best blacksmiths would eventually settle in villages or towns that offered the best opportunities, the best materials, the best pay, the best living conditions. This created an incentive for communities to treat their blacksmiths well. If you didn't, someone else would offer him better terms and he'd move. Over generations, this meant that the best smiths congregated in the most prosperous areas, which further increased the prosperity of those areas, which continued the cycle. A village without a good blacksmith was at a disadvantage not just economically, but culturally and militarily too. In times of war or conflict, the blacksmith became even more critically important. If a village was expecting raids or needed to defend itself, suddenly the blacksmith's ability to produce or repair weapons became the difference between survival and catastrophe. A blacksmith would be conscripted heavily for war work. He might work 18-hour days producing spearheads, sword blades, armor plates, anything that could be weaponized. His entire output would be directed toward military production. Sometimes blacksmiths were even excused from regular duties and given extra resources and workers to maximize weapons production. They were treated almost like military contractors are treated today, vital to the war effort. This also gave blacksmiths a kind of power during conflicts. They could sometimes leverage their essential role to negotiate better treatment or protection. Some blacksmiths become quite wealthy during times of war because both sides were desperate for their services and willing to pay premium prices. But this also meant they were targets. If an enemy force raided a village, they might specifically seek out and capture or kill the blacksmith, knowing that his absence would cripple the community's ability to resist further. The technology that blacksmiths created and refined was genuinely transformative to medieval society. Better metal tools meant more efficient agriculture. Horseshoes meant horses could travel farther and faster, improving trade and communication. Improved weapons meant military forces could be more effective. Metal reinforcements on wooden structures meant buildings could be larger and more stable. Metal hinges and locks made security possible. The blacksmith's hammer was essentially the hammer of progress, driving technological advancement. And yet, because they worked with physical metals rather than with ideas or philosophy, medieval scholars and clerics often didn't give blacksmiths enough credit. The written records of the time focused on nobility, clergy, learned men. Blacksmiths were just common workers, barely mentioned in chronicles and histories. But if you actually look at what happened in villages, if you trace the practical necessities of daily life, the blacksmith's influence is everywhere. Every castle wall was reinforced with metalwork a blacksmith made. Every knight's armor came from a blacksmith. Every tool that built the medieval world came from a blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith's legacy is everywhere, even if his name isn't written in history books. What's particularly interesting is how blacksmiths often positioned themselves as slightly special within the craftspeople hierarchy. They weren't serfs bound to the land. They weren't merchants trading in other people's goods. They were creators of essential material goods. There was something almost magical about what they did, transmuting raw ore and coal into tools and weapons and art. Medieval people didn't fully understand metallurgy. They didn't know the chemistry of what was happening, so there was often a mystical quality ascribed to blacksmithing. The blacksmith was part craftsman, part magician, part priest. He worked with fire, one of the classical elements. He created things that seemed to appear from nothing, tools that could transform other materials, weapons that could change the course of battles. The blacksmith occupied a liminal space, not quite ordinary, not quite magical, but something in between. This reputation added to his status and importance. People listened to the blacksmith not just because he was useful, but because there was a quality of respect and even slight awe around what he did and who he was. Over time, particularly as medieval society evolved, some blacksmiths became founders of dynastic lines. A particularly successful blacksmith might pass his shop and his knowledge to his son, who would pass it to his son. Within a few generations, you'd have a family of renowned blacksmiths, famous throughout the region for their quality work. These families sometimes became minor nobility over generations, their blacksmithing heritage becoming a mark of distinction rather than common work. This happened because the foundation was so strong. If you were good at something that everyone needed, if you made good money from it, if you had the skills to pass on to your children, wealth and status could accumulate. The blacksmith was one of the few positions in medieval society where genuine social mobility was possible. You could be born into poverty, apprentice to a master blacksmith, work hard for a decade or two, and eventually own a profitable shop and have genuine wealth and status. This was rare in the medieval world. Most people didn't have these opportunities, but the blacksmith did, and some of them took full advantage. The relationship between the blacksmith and other craftspeople in the village was interesting and complex. In some ways, the blacksmith was at the top of the craft hierarchy. Everyone else depended on him for their tools. The carpenter needed the blacksmith to make or repair his tools. The stonemason needed the blacksmith's chisels and hammers. The potter needed metal reinforcements for his oven. The weaver needed metal fixtures for her loom. Every single craft was downstream from the blacksmith. But the blacksmith also depended on these other crafts. He needed the carpenter to build and maintain his shop. He needed the stonemason to construct his furnace and chimney. He needed the potter to make containers for his materials. So while there was a hierarchy of dependence, it was also collaborative and mutually supporting. The craftspeople of a village, with the blacksmith at the center, formed an ecosystem. They supported each other, learned from each other, sometimes even intermarried and created family alliances. The blacksmith's daughter might marry the master carpenter's son, creating connections between families and businesses. Over generations, these networks became incredibly strong and complex. The blacksmith was often the node at the center of these networks, the person who knew everyone and everything that was happening in the craft community. What happened when a village lost its blacksmith was often disaster. If the blacksmith died without a trained successor, the village could face a genuine crisis. It might take years to attract a new blacksmith willing to move to the village. In the meantime, tools that broke couldn't be fixed. New tools couldn't be made. The village's productive capacity would plummet. Farmers would struggle. Merchants would struggle. Defense would be compromised. Some villages never fully recovered from losing a skilled blacksmith. The community might stagnate, lose population, gradually become less prosperous. Over time, what had been a thriving village might become a backwater. This is one of the reasons that blacksmiths were so valued and protected. Villages understood, sometimes explicitly, that losing the blacksmith meant losing the future. So they treated blacksmiths well. They offered them incentives to stay. They provided protection and resources. They gave them status and respect, because the alternative was losing the blacksmith and facing decline. When you think about the structure of a medieval village and why it functioned as well as it did, the blacksmith is often invisible in our modern understanding of history. We focus on lords and knights and clergy. We think about feudalism and social hierarchy and land rights. But the blacksmith is almost always overlooked, relegated to a minor role in the stories we tell about the medieval world. Yet if you were actually living in a medieval village, the blacksmith would have been absolutely central to your survival and well-being. Every day you would benefit from his work, either directly or indirectly. The tools in your hands, the horseshoes on your horse, the hinges on your door, the nails holding your home together, the metal reinforcements on your plow, all of it came from the blacksmith. He was the foundation that everything else was built on. His hammer striking metal was the sound that marked civilization existing in that place. When archaeologists examine medieval village sites, they look for the blacksmith's forge. It's a marker of sophistication and organization. Villages with skilled blacksmiths generally had more complex crafting structures, better tools, more diverse economic activity. The blacksmith didn't just make things. He enabled civilization. He made possible the complexity and advancement that medieval society, despite all its limitations and brutality, managed to achieve. In a very real sense, the medieval world was built by the blacksmith's hammer, striking sparks into the darkness, creating light and heat in the foundations of human progress. The blacksmith was the most important man in the village because without him, there was no village worth living in.